In this lesson, we're going to learn CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets. Based on the name, it's used to style our web page. So it's used to change the appearance of our HTML elements. So I've actually prepared. In this lesson, we're going to learn CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets. Based on the name, it's used to style our web page. So it's used to change the appearance of our HTML elements. So I've actually prepared a project that we can do in this lesson. So we're going to open this Cascading Style Sheets. Based on the name, it's used to style our web page. So it's used to change the appearance of our HTML elements. So I've actually prepared a project that we can do in this lesson. So we're going to open this project by going to supersimple.dev/exercises/buttons. So on this web page, I have some really nice looking buttons from famous websites, namely YouTube and Twitter, that we can copy and practice our CSS with. So we're going to go into our code and we're actually going to create a new file for this exercise. So let's create a new file and let's call it buttons.html. And we're going to open our new HTML file in our browser. So let's open the folder that contains our buttons.size. So let's create a new file and let's call it buttons.html. And we're going to open our new HTML file in our browser. So let's open the folder that contains our code. We're going to right click, open with Google Chrome. And now I'm going to set this up by moving our reference design to the bottom like this, so that it's easier for us to copy it with CSS. I'm just going to move that to the corner, and then we can work. Here. So first, let's work on creating the subscribe button. So just like we learned before, we're going to create a button using HTML. So less than, button, greater than. And then inside our button, we're going to have the text subscribe. And now let's save and refresh our page. And now we have our button. Next, we're going to start changing the appearance of this button so that it looks like the subscribe button from YouTube. Let's go into our code and we're going to start writing some CSS to change the appearance of this HTML element. So to write CSS, we have to create a new element called a style element. So this style element is unique in that it doesn't appear visibly on the page. So for example, if we save our file and then we reload the page, the style element doesn't actually create anything. So the purpose of this element is that inside this element, we can write CSS code, which modifies the appearance of other elements. For example, let's write our first bit of CSS code. We're going to type button, open squiggly bracket, close squiggly bracket. And then inside these brackets, we're basically going to give instructions to the computer on how to modify the appearance. For example, we can set the background dash color colon red and semicolon. So make sure that you write this out exactly as I have it here so that we're following the syntax rules for colon red and semicolon. How to modify the appearance. For example, we can set the background dash color colon red and semicolon. So make sure that you write this out exactly as I have it here so that we're following the syntax rules for CSS. So let's save this file and refresh our page. And now you can see that we set the background color of the button to red. So as you can see, CSS is similar to HTML. We're simply giving instructions to the computer, and then the computer follows our instructions step by step. And just like HTML, we have to follow certain syntax rules when writing our CSS so that the computer understands our code. So what are the syntax rules for CSS? How does this code work? So the word at the front here is called a CSS selector. It tells the computer which elements on the page we are targeting with our CSS code. In this case, the word at the front here is called a CSS selector. It tells the computer which elements on the page we are targeting with our CSS code. In this case, we are targeting all buttons on the page, and we're going to change the it tells the computer which elements on the page we are targeting with our CSS code. In this case, we are targeting all buttons on the page, and we're going to change the background color of all buttons on the page to red. Now, inside these brackets, there are other rules that we have to follow. The text to the left of this colon is called the CSS property. It tells the computer what we are changing. To the right of the colon is the CSS value. It tells the computer what we're changing the property to. In this case, we're changing the property background color to red, and that's exactly what the computer did. The colon is here to just separate the property CSS value. It tells the computer what we're changing the property to. In this case, we're changing the property background color to red, and that's exactly what the computer did. The colon is here to just separate the property and the value, and the semicolon here is just like a period in English. In English, you end sentences with a period. In CSS, you end a style with a semicolon. So that's what all of this syntax means. So we can actually add multiple styles inside these brackets. So let's go ahead and add another style. We're going to change the text color to white to match this design. So the property for changing the text color is called color. So notice that it's not called text color. It's just something that we have to remember. We're going to change it to white, and we'll end it with a semicolon. Let's save and refresh. And now you can see that we changed the text color of this button to white. And that's basically how CSS works. We tell the computer what we're targeting, and then we give some styles. And the computer is going to apply these styles one by one. So let's do another example. This time we'll set the border property. So notice that our button has a border, while the subscribe button here doesn't have a border. So we're going to set the border property to none. And we're going to save this file and refresh. And now we just remove the border. So if you look at our styles here, it's actually pretty straightforward. They're pretty easy to read. We set the background color to red, text color to white, and border to none. So just like HTML, CSS is pretty straightforward. We're essentially just giving the computer instructions. So the general technique, we'll learn the code for creating a search box. Enter. Let's height. So our button is a little bit short. I'm going to make it taller. So I'm going to set the height to something like 50 px. The px here represents pixels. Pixels are a very common unit of measurement in the digital world. Image sizes are measured in pixels, video sizes are measured in pixels, and your screen size is also measured in pixels. In this case, we're going to set the button height to 50 pixels, And don't worry too much about knowing what 50 pixels looks like. The more that you write CSS and work with pixels, the more you get a sense for how big these measurements turn out to be. So for now, let's save this file and refresh the page. And now we have a button that is 50 pixels tall, but it actually looks like it's a little too tall. So I'm going to change the height to something like 30 pixels. And we're going to refresh the page again. And I actually want it to be a little bit taller. So I'm going to change it to maybe 36. I'm going to refresh. And I think that looks pretty good to me. So you see that in CSS, we do a lot of trial and error to get our measurements right. Now let's keep working step by step to get to our design. Next, we're going to adjust the width. So let's change this to something like 100 pixels. Let's see how that looks. I'm going to save it, refresh, and I think it looks a little bit too small, so I'm going to increase it just a little bit, 105. And refresh. Okay, I think that looks good enough for me. Next, we're going to change the background color because currently our red is not the same as our design. So VS Code has a really nice feature, which is a color picker. So if we hover over this color box here, it gives us access to a color picker that we can pick another color with. So I'm going to pick something that's a little closer to what I see at the bottom. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to pick something. So if we hover over this color box here, it gives us access to a color picker that we can pick another color with. So I'm going to pick something that's a little closer to what I see at the bottom. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to pick something like 200, 0, 0. I'm going to save this and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. So you might be wondering what this value means. We went from a color of red to RGB 200, 0, 0. So this RGB value is another way of measuring color. It's a more precise way of measuring color than just using a word like red or white. So the way that RGB works is that pretty much every color can be created using a combination of red, green, and blue. So that's what this syntax represents. The R represents how much red we have in color. So you might be closer to what I see at the bottom. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to pick something like 200, 0, 0. I'm going to save this and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. So you might be wondering what this value means. We went from a color of red to RGB 200, 0, 0. So this RGB value is another way of measuring color. It's a more precise way of measuring color than just using a word like red or white. So the way that RGB works is that pretty much every color can be created using a combination of red, green, and blue. So that's what this syntax represents. The R represents how much red we have in this color, G represents how much green, and B represents how much blue. And these three numbers represent how much value is another way of measuring color. It's a more precise way of measuring color than just using a word like red or white. So the way that RGB works is that pretty much every color can be created using a combination of red, green, and blue. So that's what this syntax represents. The R represents how much red we have in this color, G represents how much green, and B represents how much blue. And these three numbers represent how much red we have, how much green, and how much blue. The minimum value is 0 and the maximum value is 255. So if we removed all the red and green and we just have maximum blue and we save, that's going to get us a blue color. On the other hand, if we have all green color and we get rid of the blue, we're going to have a green color. So this is basically how RGB works. It's a combination of red, green, and blue to create any color that we want. Now don't worry too much about knowing what an RGB value looks like. And these three numbers, that's a little closer to what I see at the bottom. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to pick something like 200, 00. Okay, I think that looks good enough for me. Next, we're going to change the background color because currently our red is not the same as our design. So VS Code has a really nice feature, which is a color picker. So if we hover over this color box here, it gives us access to a color picker that we can pick another color with. So I'm going to pick something that's a little closer to what I see at the bottom. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to pick something like 200, 00. I'm going to save this and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. So you might be wondering what this value means. We went from a color of red to RGB 200, 00. So this RGB value is another way of measuring color. It's a more precise way of measuring color than just using a word like red or white. So the way that RGB works is that pretty much every color can be created using a combination of red, green, and blue. So that's what this syntax represents. The R represents how much red we have in this color, G represents how much green, and B represents how much blue. And these three numbers represent how much red we have, how much green, and how much blue. The minimum value is 0 and the maximum value is 255. So if we removed all the red and green and we just have maximum blue and we save, that's going to get us a blue color. On the other hand, if we have all green color and we get rid of the blue, we're going to have a green color. So this is basically how RGB works. It's a combination of red, green, and blue to create any color that we want. Now don't worry too much about knowing what an RGB value looks like. For example, if you have a random value like this, if you gave this to me, I wouldn't even know what this color was. Usually I just use the color picker to pick the color that I want, and then it will give me the RGB value that I need. The only RGB values I suggest you remember are if we set all the colors to the maximum value, so 255, 255, and 255, this creates white. So we save it and refresh, that creates white. If we set all of these three to 0, that creates black. And we refresh, that creates a black color. So now let's go back to what we had before, which I think was 200, 00, and we'll save and refresh. And the next thing we're going to change is, you might not be able to see it, but if we zoom in here, this button has rounded corners, while our button has pointy corners. So to make rounded corners, the CSS property for doing that is border dash radius, and the border radius takes a pixel measurement. The higher the pixels, the more round the corners will be. So for now, let's try 2 pixels and save. Now if we refresh the page, our button now has rounded corners just like our design. So I'm going to zoom back out and zoom back out. So the last thing I'm going to change is if we hover over this button, you'll notice that our mouse turns into this sort of hand. This hand is called a pointer. So we're going to change the cursor. The mouse, this thing that you point around, is usually called a cursor. And we're going to change the cursor to a pointer. Let's save and refresh. And that's how you get this hand whenever your mouse is over this button. So that's basically how we go from a basic HTML button to something that looks more professional. We create the button with HTML, and then we set the styles one by one. Now you might be wondering, how do I know all of these CSS properties? How are you supposed to memorize all of these? So usually when I don't know the CSS property for something, for example, if I want to create rounded corners, I would go to Google and search something like CSS and what I want to do. So let's say I want round corners. And usually the first few links give some really good suggestions on what the property is. So here right away we have the border radius property in the first link, and it gives us some sample code that we can use. So that's how I discover all of these CSS properties. I look at a design and I ask myself, okay, what do I need to achieve this design? And then I search for it in Google. So don't worry, as you use CSS more and more, you're going to have to Google things that you don't know, and you'll just get used to the process of finding answers by searching for them. But for the purposes of this course, I'm going to give you a lot of these CSS properties so that you can get some good practice with them. The next step we're going to do is to copy this join button. So let's create a new button on our page with HTML. And this is going to be the join button. So we're going to put the text join inside this button. Let's save it and refresh. And unfortunately, it looks like our join button looks like the subscribe button. And that's because in our CSS, this word button means that all of these styles are targeted to all buttons on the page. So how do we get these styles to only target the subscribe button? So we're going to learn a new HTML attribute that we can use for this. So remember in the previous lesson, we learned that attributes modify the behavior of elements. In this lesson, we're going to learn a very useful attribute that is used a lot in CSS. We're going to go to the opening tag again, and we're going to add a new attribute called the class attribute. So we're going to type class equals quotes quotes. So the class attribute basically lets us label HTML elements. For example, let's label this button the subscribe button. And also my code is getting a little long for this line, so I'm going to put the text on a new line to make it easier to read. So remember, according to HTML syntax, these extra spaces don't matter. They're ignored. So now that we set the class attribute, we've essentially set a label to this button, and we can target this label in our CSS. So to target a class in CSS, we can start with a dot, and then we're going to type out the class name. So we're going to type out subscribe-button. So according to CSS syntax, if we start this code with a dot, that means we're going to target a class name instead of an element name like button. So here, we're going to start targeting just any element that has the class subscribe button. So if we save and refresh, now you'll see that all of these styles only apply to elements that have the class subscribe. And our join button does not have any of these styles. Now multiple elements can and have the same class. So for example, if I set the class of the join button to subscribe-button, all of these styles will be applied to any element with the subscribe button class. That's what this dot means. And that means these are going to be applied to this and this. So if we save and refresh, now the join button has these styles again because it has a class of subscribe button. But for our purposes, we actually want this to have a different set of styles. So let's give a different class to the join button. We're going to give the class join. And I'm also going to reformat my code a little to make it easier to read. So let's save and refresh. And now we're back to where we can start modifying our join button. Now let's start styling our join button to match our design. So remember, the general strategy is to create the element with HTML like this, and then style it one by one until you match your design. So first we're going to target the class. That's what this dot means. We're going to target the class join-button. Okay, so let's set the background dash color to white. Let's save it and refresh. And next, let's deal with the border. So our border is a little bit gray. We can set it to maybe border dash color to blue. And let's see how that looks. Let's save it and refresh. Okay, so it looks a little darker than what we have in our design. So let's go into our color picker and pick a more accurate color. So I'm just going to do this by eye. Don't worry if it's not totally accurate. We're just trying to get something that's close enough. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to pick something like, maybe something like this. Let's save it, refresh. And that's a little bit too dark. So I'm going to pick something a little bit lighter. Save it and refresh. Okay, I think that's pretty good. But we also noticed that our border is a little weird. So on the top, it looks like it's a lighter shade of blue. And at the bottom, it's kind of a darker shade of blue. So to fix that, we're going to set the border style to be a solid color. Let's save this and refresh. And now we get a solid color all around. The next thing we can change is our border looks a little bit thick compared to the design. So we're going to change the border dash width. So you'll see that a lot of these styles are pretty self-explanatory. So we're going to set the border width to, let's say, 1 pixel. Let's save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Next, we're going to set the text color. So we're going to set the text color to blue and have it the same as our border. So remember, the property to set text color is called color, and we're going to copy this color down here. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks a little light, but I think it's okay. Now we're going to set the height and the width. So let's set the height to be something like 36 pixels to match our subscribe button. Refresh. Okay, and now we're going to set the width. So let's try, I don't know, 60 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save and refresh. Okay, I'm going to set it to maybe 62. Okay, let's save and refresh. And again, we're going to set some rounded corners. So that is border dash radius 2 pixels. We're going to save it and refresh. And now we're almost there to matching this design. The last one we're going to set is cursor pointer to get that nice hand pointer when we're hovering over the button. So refresh. Now when we're hovering over the join button, we have this nice pointer icon. So another thing we notice is that there's a lot of space between these two buttons, and there's not a lot of space between ours. So in CSS, space is called margin. So to add space, we're going to add some margin. So let's go to the subscribe button styles, and we're going to add some margin dash right. So we're going to add some margin or some space to the right of this button. And we're going to set the space to maybe 8 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save and refresh. And that looks pretty good to me. So now we're done with the join button. Lastly, we're going to create this tweet button. Let's go back into our code. And remember, our general technique is to, number 1, create the element with HTML. And then number 2, style it with CSS one by one. So we're going to create a button with a text tweet. I'm going to move my editor a little bit to the right here so we can see it. I'll move this here as well. And let's refresh our page. So now this button has the same style as a join button because it has a join button class, and that's being targeted up here. So instead of the join button, we're going to give a class or a label of tweet button. And now save and refresh. And now we're back to the default styles. So in our CSS, we're going to write some code. We're going to target the class. So we start with a dot to target a class. We're going to target the tweet button class. So just like our other buttons, we're going to adjust the style of this button one by one until we match our design. So let's start off with the background dash color. Let's set this to blue to start off with. Now I'm going to try my best to match the Twitter blue that we have here. So I'm going to pick something like this, and I think that looks pretty good. Save it and refresh. Okay, we'll leave it like that for now. We might adjust it later. Let's change the color now to white. So that'll change the text color. Okay, let's get rid of the border. Refresh and save. Let's give it a height of 36 pixels to match our other buttons. Okay. And the color is a little bit off, so I'm going to adjust it just a bit. Maybe it should be a little more like this. Save it, refresh. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this. Now we're going to adjust the width to maybe 105. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that's a little too much. Let's adjust it to 80. Let's adjust it to 70. So as you can see, there's a lot of trial and error when we're working with CSS. Now to get this rounded effect, we can set a border radius. Let's start with 2 pixels. If we refresh, we get rounded corners. If we start increasing the pixels for the border radius, let's save and refresh, it starts getting rounder and rounder. So the trick to getting these round buttons is we have to set the border radius to half the height or the width, whichever is lower. So in this case, the height is 36. If we set the border radius to half of that, which is 18, save and refresh, that's how we get this rounded color. The last thing we're going to do is to bold the text in here. So in our design, this tweet text here is very bold. So we're going to make our font bold as well. So to do that, we're going to set this property called font-weight. I'm going to set it to bold. Save and refresh. Okay, it looks pretty good. It looks like this font is actually a little bigger than ours. So let's actually set the font-size. Set it to maybe 15. See how that looks. Save and refresh. Okay, I think that looks pretty close. I'm going to change the width to maybe 74. See how that looks. Okay, so I think this is good enough. Currently, we're just trying to copy things by eye. Later, I'll show you a technique of how to copy these colors and measurements exactly. But for now, it's good enough to be able to achieve these designs just by looking at them. So the last thing for this button is to add the cursor pointer. Let's save it and refresh. So if we hover over this button, we now get a nice pointer for our cursor. So the last thing I'm going to adjust here is the spacing between these two buttons. Remember, spacing in CSS is called margin. So we're going to add to the join button. Actually, let's add it to the tweet button just for practice. We're going to add spacing. So we're going to add margin to the left, colon, and let's make it 8 pixels like we had it for the subscribe button. Let's save it and refresh. And there we go. So we took our basic buttons and we were able to copy these really nice looking designs just by looking at them. And the technique that we use for doing this is first we create the element with HTML, and then we style it with CSS one by one until it looks close enough to our design.
Create a professional logo that best reflects your brand. Just go to Wix.
So here are a bunch of exercises from other we create the element with fresh, and there we go. So we took our basic buttons and we were able to copy these really nice looking designs just by looking at them. And the technique that we use for doing this is first we create the element with HTML, and then we style it with CSS one by one until it looks close enough to our design. So here are a bunch of exercises from other popular websites that you can try out for yourself. This is a good challenge for you to be able to look at a website by eye and use CSS to copy the styles that you see. In this lesson, we're going to learn some intermediate CSS skills, such as how to create hovers, transitions, for yourself.
তাহলে এটা তো না কোনো ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ডই নাই, মানে এটা তো বাটন না, জাস্ট একটা প্যারাগ্রাফ হবে। প্যারাগ্রাফ দিয়ে দেখি। I don't know এভাবে হবে কিনা। I don't know. আচ্ছা, I don't know. মার্জিন ঠিকঠাক আছে। ফন্ট সাইজটা একটু ছোট করতে হবে। আচ্ছা, ওগুলো পরে দেখা যাবে। ডেলিভারি টুমোরো এটা কি করবো? সেম জিনিস বাট দেশীয় কোম্পানি। কাছাকাছি ছিল। একটু পরে একটু পরে তো বললাম, একটু পরে। Almost. Let's see. তাহলে একটু কি হবে? Font. Font size. Doesn't look like in between. Difference, the difference concept. It's okay, but add to cart.
and use CSS to copy the styles that you see. In this lesson, we're going to learn some intermediate CSS skills, such as how to create hovers, transitions, and shadows. For most buttons you see on the internet, if we hover over them with our mouse, they change their style slightly. Some of them get darker, some of them get